The afternoon light over Windsor was soft and golden, the kind of light that made even the gravel paths look warm. Birds moved quietly through the old trees. A gardener somewhere in the distance was trimming something that did not need trimming. Everything on the estate had that particular stillness, the stillness of a place where people lived very large lives very quietly. At the entrance to Adelaide Cottage, a royal guard stood at his post. He was young. Not inexperienced, you do not get posted to a royal residence without years of training behind you, but young enough that his uniform still looked like it wore him rather than the other way around. He stood straight. He did not move when the wind changed. He had been given his instructions that morning, and his instructions were clear. The Princess of Wales was resting. No visitors without prior coordination. No exceptions. He had nodded when told this. He had not asked why. That was not his job. Camilla had not planned to stay long. She had been on the Windsor grounds for another reason entirely, a brief walkthrough with her personal secretary, a quick stop at one of the estate offices, when the idea had come to her the way small ideas often come to people who live in large houses, casually, sideways, without much weight behind it. Adelaide Cottage was nearby. She would stop in. Say hello. See the children, perhaps, or at least leave a word for Catherine. It was the kind of thing she had done many times before. She walked toward the cottage with the easy confidence of a woman who had learned, over many decades, how to move through the world of palaces and protocols without making it look like effort. She had earned that ease the hard way. There had been years, long, difficult years, when every room she entered had people in it who were not quite sure what to make of her. When every public appearance had an undercurrent of judgment she was not allowed to acknowledge. She had walked through all of that with her head up and her expression neutral, and eventually the rooms had changed around her. She was queen now. She was still walking toward a cottage door. The guard saw her coming from a distance and did not allow himself to react. Not visibly. Inside, something in his chest tightened, the specific tightening of a person who knows that the next 30 seconds are going to require a great deal of steadiness. He had been prepared for this. He had not expected it to actually happen. She reached the gate. "Good afternoon," she said. Warm. Easy. The kind of greeting that carries within it the quiet assumption that the door will now open. "Good afternoon, Your Majesty," he said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that later, though he never told anyone. There was a pause. She looked at him the way people look at things that are not yet making sense. "I was going to pop in and see the princess." He did not step aside. He did not reach for the gate. He held the line, not aggressively, not coldly, but with the particular firmness of someone who understands that the kindest version of this moment is the one where it is over quickly. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," he said. "The princess needs her rest, ma'am." The world kept moving around them. A bird called somewhere in the trees. The distant gardener's shears made a clean, quiet sound. Somewhere inside Adelaide Cottage, behind a closed door that was just a door and also very much not just a door, Catherine was resting. Camilla looked at the guard. The guard looked, respectfully, at a fixed point just past her shoulder. 6 words. That was all it had taken. 6 words, spoken by a young man in a pressed uniform, to communicate something that no one in the family would ever say out loud at a dinner table, or in a press release, or in any of the carefully worded statements that moved like slow weather through the palace communications offices. She held this household. Not by rank. By something else entirely. To understand what that moment meant, you have to understand what Adelaide Cottage was. When William and Catherine chose to move their family there, they were making a statement, though they would never have called it that. The cottage is not grand. By royal standards, it is almost aggressively modest: 4 bedrooms, a garden, a normal-sized kitchen where a family could eat breakfast without it being a ceremony. They had turned down larger properties. They had wanted something that felt like a choice they had made rather than a role they had been handed. Inside those walls, they were trying, genuinely, carefully trying, to give their children a life that touched the ground. School runs. Homework. The ordinary friction of being a family in a house that was the right size. George and Charlotte and Louis had friends who came through that door. The children knew the names of the animals in the garden. Catherine had built that life deliberately, piece by piece, with the focused energy of a woman who understood that the alternative was to let the institution build it for her. And the institution, if left to itself, builds things that are very impressive and not very human. She had made the cottage into something human. Which meant that the cottage had rules that were hers. Not the palace's. Not the institution's. Hers. The guard at the door was not enforcing a royal protocol handed down from some ancient office. He was enforcing a preference, a simple, clear preference from a woman inside a house she had made into a home. The preference was, I need my rest. The preference was, not today. The preference was, underneath all of it, something even simpler and more significant, this is my threshold, and I decide who crosses it. There are many kinds of power in a royal family. There is the power of title, the official kind, the kind that lives in documents and forms of address and the order in which people enter rooms. That kind of power has a clear shape. You can point to it. You can trace its history through centuries of law and tradition. Camilla holds that power now, in the most complete form available to a woman in the British royal family. She is queen. When she enters a room, the room rearranges itself. And then there is the other kind. The other kind does not have a name on a document. It is not conferred by ceremony or announced by a herald. It builds slowly, over years, through a million small moments of showing up, in hospital wards and school halls and village fetes and community centers, and making people feel that the person in front of them actually sees them. It is built through grief that is shared publicly and with grace. Through a wedding dress that stopped traffic. Through 3 children photographed on doorsteps looking like children, not portraits. Through a quality of attention that people can feel even through a screen. Catherine had been building that second kind of power since the day she married William. And on this particular afternoon, it had taken the form of a closed cottage door and a guard who would not move. The thing about Camilla is that she understood exactly what was happening. She is not a woman who has survived what she has survived by failing to understand rooms. She had read the atmospheres of dinners and ceremonies and public appearances for decades. She had sat in rooms full of people who did not want her there and found ways to be present without making anyone more uncomfortable than they already were. She was perceptive. She was patient. She had waited for things that most people would not have had the endurance to wait for. She understood what 6 words from a guard at a cottage door meant. She did not make a scene. Of course she did not make a scene. Making a scene would have been wrong in every direction, wrong for the family, wrong for the institution, wrong for the particular kind of dignity she had spent years building for herself. And besides, there was nothing to make a scene about. The guard had been polite. He had been correct. He had, in fact, been doing exactly what he had been asked to do by a household that had every right to ask it. She turned. She walked back the way she had come. The gravel was still warm under the afternoon light. The gardener was still clipping something. The birds were still moving through the trees. Everything looked the same as it had looked 5 minutes earlier, and nothing at all was the same. Inside Adelaide Cottage, it is possible that Catherine never knew. It is also possible that she knew immediately, that her lady-in-waiting told her quietly within the hour, or that she saw it on a staff member's face that evening, or that she simply understood, the way people understand things that happen on their behalf without anyone having to explain them. If she knew, she said nothing about it publicly. There was no statement. No explanation. No gracious clarification from her communications office. The silence was complete and deliberate, the way silence in royal circles is always complete and deliberate. But there is something worth noticing about what that silence meant. If Catherine had wanted to override the guard's decision, if she had wanted to open the door, to wave Camilla through, to make the moment smaller than it was, she could have. A word to her household team would have been enough. The guard would have received new instructions. The gate would have opened. The whole thing would have dissolved into a pleasant visit and a shared pot of tea. She let it stand. That is not a small thing. That is a woman, in the quietest possible way, drawing a line around her home and saying, "Here, I choose what happens." Not because she wanted a confrontation with Camilla. Not because she was making a political statement about hierarchy or succession or the complicated emotional history of this family. But because she was tired, and because it was her home, and because the right to say not today belongs to everyone, including the women who live inside royal gates. The guard went home that evening, or rather, He went off duty and returned to his quarters, and almost certainly did not sleep easily. Not because he had done something wrong. He had done everything right. But there is a particular kind of tension that lives in the body after a moment like that, the tension of having been the hinge on which something significant turned, without having any control over what the something was. He had been a door, in the most literal sense. He had been the instrument through which one woman's preference had met another woman's assumption, and the preference had won. He was proud of his professionalism. He was also 20-something years old and had just told the Queen of England that no, she could not go inside. These two things coexisted in him, probably for quite a while. What makes this story worth telling is not the drama of it. There is no drama, not really, no raised voices, no tears, no fractured relationships playing out in the public eye. What makes it worth telling is what it reveals about how power actually works in a family that is also an institution, and in a family that has spent years managing the gap between those two things. Title moves in one direction. Devotion moves in another. And sometimes, in a quiet corridor of a Windsor afternoon, those two directions meet at a cottage door. Camilla has everything the institution can give her. She has the title, the residence, the formal authority, the place in the order of precedence. She has come further than most people expected, further than many people wanted, and she has arrived there with more grace than the journey perhaps deserved. Catherine has something the institution cannot give and cannot take away. She has the feeling of the people, not as a demographic or a poll number, but as a genuine, living affection that has built itself over years through a quality of presence that is very difficult to manufacture and impossible to fake. People feel seen by her. That is a specific and rare thing. It is also, it turns out, a kind of protection. There is a last detail worth sitting with. The guard said, "The princess needs her rest." Not, "Her Royal Highness requests privacy." Not, "The princess is unavailable at this time." Not any of the formal constructions that palace staff are trained to deploy when they need to say something difficult in the softest possible language. He said she needs her rest. The word needs is human. It is the word you use for a person, not a protocol. It is the word a mother uses for a tired child, or a good friend uses when explaining why someone cannot come to the phone. It implies care. It implies that the person inside the door matters, and that what they need today is to be still, and that this is worth protecting. Whether the guard chose that word consciously or it simply came out of him in the moment, it was the right word. It was the only word. Because what Catherine had built at Adelaide Cottage was not a fortress or a residence or a strategic retreat from public life. It was a home where people needed things, rest, and ordinary evenings, and the right to decide who came through the door. The guard protected that. He did his job perfectly. And Camilla, to her credit, let him. She walked back through the golden afternoon, the gravel quiet under her feet, and the door behind her stayed closed. No one explained it. No one needed to. In a family where almost everything is communicated through ceremony and protocol and the careful management of appearances, this particular message arrived through the simplest possible channel. A closed door. A young man who did not move. 6 words that said everything.